さあ皆さんこんにちは、こんばんは。私リーカイと申します。そして目の前にいる
私は
はいどうぞ。
私はジョンでございます。
はい、
本日も今週もどうぞよろ
よろしくお願いい
し
たします。そう今週は We read David and Goliath by Malcom Gladwell. Thank you for the visual. ざっくり言うと This book is about tweaking your perspective on advantages and disadvantages of situations that you see. And he mainly uses David and Goliath as the main like a vehicle to kind of prove that point. So we'll touch on the story of David and Goliath. Excuse me. And then we will dive deep into most of the chapters. Mostly will be the first half because we'll talk about that later too, but it'll be most of the first half. And so yeah, chapter 1, or sorry, part 1, or before I even move on, John, do you have anything you wanted to say? Sorry.
So I read this book like 4 years ago, back when I was in freshman university, and back then it was a pretty cool read. It was all theoretical to me back then, but this past 4 years made this book much more practical in a sense. I think the reason why is because of the experiences I had in between that made it more easy for me to understand and visualize what he's trying to say at a higher resolution. So reading this book the second time was like reading a different book, but overall it was fun. A really good reminder for especially people who are trying to make big decisions in their lives. So hopefully whoever's listening right now who hasn't read this book will enjoy today's book review.
And who also feel like they're kind of cornered or they are at a disadvantage in certain situations. This book really does talk about really changing your perspective on it and looking at it through a different lens. So, okay, so let's jump right in. So I think we should start with talking about why he named the book David and Goliath. So we kind of touched upon the idea of recalibrating your disadvantage and advantage notions. And he brings David and Goliath, which is a story kind of like about few thousand years ago, about this Philistines and Israelites のこの戦いがあって、and then there's a Goliath from the Philistine side, and then they didn't want to have all out like full-fledged war, and to mitigate or minimize the number of casualties, I guess they usually sorted out with 101 duels. And so on one side was Goliath, and then he was this huge mighty warrior, like a giant, and so he challenges the opponent army to fight on the single combat. But on the other end, the other side of the war, the Israelites didn't have anyone that was courageous enough for up to par at his level of swordmanship, I should say. So but then this David, this shepherd boy, walks in front and be like, hey, you know what, I'll do this. And then like David's king or someone was like, hey, here's the sword and here's the armor, shield, and blah blah blah. And David's like, nah. And then he goes out to the field and meets Goliath in the middle. But David was a shepherd boy, and he likes to use, or like is really expert in using his slingshots. And so he would go up to Goliath and like, all the odds are stacked against him. If you would think in this it's a conventional notion of Goliath being like, I think he was like some like really tall person, muscular, and he's trained, so like you would typically think he's more advantageous. But then if you look at but then David goes ahead and uses his slingshot and like hits Goliath in the head and knocks him out and pretty much kills him. And so that is a good example because, like I mentioned a little bit just a few seconds before, we all think that being big and using the sword well is advantageous, but like who said that using the sword and being big and tall is the only way to win these duels or like battles? And so David comes in and just really wrecks him and like kills him instantly without being the typical conventional warrior. And so he uses that as a intro opener to all these other different stories that we'll talk about, and how a lot of times advantage is not really advantaged and disadvantage is not really disadvantaged. But yeah, John, go ahead. Do you have any inputs on that?
No, that was pretty much it. And when I first read it, that was so eye-opening because I think I was prone to that misconception or the conventional belief that being that hefty, muscular, battle-seasoned warrior is the only way to defeat another battle-seasoned warrior. But yeah, just like Lika explained about that story, even a really scrawny little boy or shepherd like David can beat a seasoned warrior. And this surprisingly applies to a lot of other situations. So yeah, let's talk about those.
Yeah. So first chapter, excuse me again, is about Vivek Ranadiv is my guess in his pronunciation. Sorry. So he is one of the software engineer executives in Silicon Valley. He is now, I searched him up, and I think he is like the president or some CEO of Sacramento Kings. Yeah. So it's pretty funny. He did have, he does have some relationship with basketball, so he's not completely a newbie. Okay, we'll talk about the story, but yeah. Anyways, he was coaching his daughter's basketball team, and like I just told John, he doesn't have any experience in basketball. I think the author jokes that, or in one of his interviews that I watched on YouTube, he jokes that he's like okay, no, I shouldn't say it because it might sound okay. I don't mean racist, but he's like, because he's Indian, he doesn't know basketball. And then the interviewer was also Indian. He's like, yeah, that's true. I can relate with that. That was a friendly talk, but he doesn't know anything about basketball, and then he coaches this girl, really inexperienced group of girls, all the way up to I think national championship. They didn't win, but it's still a pretty big achievement to go up to that level with really lack of experience, even as a coach and for the players. And the way they did that is this defense strategy that basketball teams use usually up to high school, but not really much in college, or I should say NBA. We don't really see it in NBA. Would you agree with that, John?
Yeah, it's more play-based. Like, yeah, every possession, there's one side making a play, other side defending, rather than, it's not like a soccer game.
Yeah, and so to kind of briefly talk about the strategy, it's called full court press, and it comprises of with the defensive team, the defending team has all their players defending the inbound all the way from the very end, the beginning of the court until their own court. And so that's just a little summary. I'm going to show you a little video of it right now. And I will do the share screen so that everyone can see it. Oh, I need to... I'm gonna need to share sound. So I think I want to start with first showing what's a typical way or the most common way of defending, which is in this case the black team, which is the Warriors team, has the possession of the ball, and the white team, the Thunders, are now kind of falling back after scoring. They didn't score, but they're falling back to their own basket and defending. And so if I play. And this is a little atypical example too, because Curry shoots right away. But you can see that they all kind of like relax on the way back, and they don't get up on the offending or the offensive team or the attacking team. And then let's see another example. So I remember there's one more in the beginning here. Maybe not, but you'll see the difference pretty clearly once you look at this full court press. And even when you say full court press, there's like different kinds, like 1-2 press defense. This is one example of it, and we can take a look at it. So immediately you can see that the inbounding team, the green team, is coming up the court, but then the white team, defending team, is up in their face, and they're going to try to force a turnover. That means forcing them to fumble or lose control of the ball and somehow have the white team gain possession of it. And so that's the whole defense. So I'll play a little bit more. And then, I don't know if you guys caught that, but the white team, the green team kind of lost control of it. The white team gained control. They tipped it back to the other teammate, the other white player, and then now they can get a real quick fast break. Fast break is like a switch, like an immediate attack on the other way, other direction. Counterattack, there you go. So we can watch another one. They're trying to force something out. In that case, they force a travel. So this is it's useful in late game situations because so that's when they usually use it. I'm not going to go into detail why, but that's when they usually use it. But what's interesting about Vivek is that he had her daughter and her team play for almost the entirety of the game, and then so
he had his team do the full court press throughout the entire game.
And so he pretty much was, so by doing that, they're denying their ability to use their skills, passing, dribbling, shooting, denying all of it, because then they can't even bring up the ball up to their basket, the defending team's basket. And so that was his disadvantage, because the team didn't know how to play. But by using this full court press, they were able to exploit the other team's disadvantage, which was, they're not used to being played full court press all the time, the whole game. And so by doing this little trick, they were able to climb all the way up to national championship level. And for me, it was really a strong analogy. I mean, I think for John too, because we both play basketball. And it's such a visual way for Malcom, the author, to symbolize to represent his idea. And so, just because you are a newbie at a certain field or skill, there's always going to be different disadvantages that you can exploit. Did I miss anything, John?
I guess one small detail about the Vivek Manadev story is in one of the only games they lost by 3 points, and the reason why they lost by 3 points was because they only had 4 players playing that game.
Oh.
So
wow.
That shows how effective this full court press was, and how fit they are as a team.
Yeah.
Even though they're not really skillful at playing basketball, he proved that there are other ways to be relevant in this environment. So, yeah, going back to the David and Goliath story, he became the David by understanding his disadvantage.
Yeah. And there are teams, apparently it's also on the book, but where the other team's coach was furious and like would ask him to come out to the parking lot to like fight him, fist fight. I know there were issues with the refs as well. Oh, because the refs were called all the fouls, the really even touchy defense, like not touchy, it doesn't make sense. Defense where the girls were just like okay, that's even worse.
So normally a foul gets called when someone like hits somebody else or hits them with pretty significant body contact, but the referees started catching the pattern of how Vivek let the girls play basketball. Like, so the full court press to the referees and the parents seemed a bit like cheaty or like kind of cunning. So the referees started calling fouls on pretty much anything. Like, even though their shoulders rubbed a bit, they started calling fouls. And if you get 5 fouls in basketball, you can't play for the rest of the game. So players started fouling out. So they started losing players that they can have on the court. So that turned out to be their, disadvantage in a way in that environment.
Yeah.
But they lost.
It's a much better way to explain it. That's why I have Johnny Boy in this podcast. So that's the last, or not the last. That's the, I think, the main point about chapter 1. And moving on to chapter 2 is about. Yes, dozo.
Another important point in this chapter was that Vivek Venadiv, even though he got all the criticisms from the parents and referees and other colleagues or whatever, he carried through with it because he had nothing to lose. He wasn't experienced in basketball. He didn't really care about the basketball community, whatnot. He only cared about his daughter's team playing well. So he was able to make such a somewhat innovative decision. There was another example of Arabic leader during the war.
Oh, Arabic.
There's another example, but yeah, both of these stories conclude to the point where conclude that people can make innovative decisions if they have nothing to lose. And it's not only that, but it's this underdog technique, so-called, is really effective, but not many people do it. And the reason why is because it's much easier to take the conventional method. Like, if you score a basket, you go back and play defense and run through your plays and score based off on your plays. And that's much more satisfying than running up and down throughout the entire game, like looking like, and being tired at the end. It's much harder to go the underdog way, which is why not many underdogs are out there. And yeah, the part where I talked about having nothing to lose adds to that momentum of going in that underdog direction. It's more of a necessity for Vivek. So it was easier for him, in a sense, to make that underdog move. But if you look at it objectively, it's much harder to do what he did.
So that's a good point. So moving on to chapter 2 is about Teresa de Brito. And she was a principal of this middle school called Chapala Valley Middle School. And the main point about this chapter 2 is about this diagram or this inverted U curve, where it talks about there's a sweet spot. I think I should start with the wealth example. So there was a research study about what the best income level is for raising your kids, and a lot of times the common notion is the more the better. Or so if you pat on the y-axis like utility or like happiness, on the x-axis is money or salary, income, wealth. Many of those, you would imagine a linear line. But what you see is after a little bit, roughly around $74,000 US dollars, it starts to plateau. And so not adding more wealth doesn't really necessarily add more happiness. But what he or Malcolm is pointing out is this inverted U curve where if you go up and then you go plateau, there's also that if you overindulge or like if you have too much money, the utility or happiness comes back down. And that's why it creates this inverted U curve. And so this isn't so when you're too poor, you can't really you only think about surviving, and so you can't really raise kids, or like it's about work and getting by, living paycheck to paycheck every day. And so that's not necessarily good for even the parents or like the environment to raise kids. But being too rich on the other end is also doesn't work because the kids don't learn to work for things. And so what's necessary is to hit that sweet spot in the middle where Okay, so sweet spot is in the middle, where you're not worried about surviving, but you're also not, everything doesn't come free to you, and so you still have to work hard and you still have to learn about being financially responsible and having a goal in mind and so on and so forth. And this also translates to a different setting. In this case, it's a classroom setting, and there's a study about saying what's the right amount of students for the best learning environment for them. And then the argument goes that 6 is too intimate, too little, it's not diverse at all. So there's not much discussion. If they wanted a discussion, it doesn't really happen because there's not much bouncing off. And then like 12, 18, yeah, it's still kind of the same effect. But once you go 20, I think the number is 28 or something around that number, around that area, is the perfect sweet spot. And the higher you go, or the more students you have, it happens so that it gets too chaotic. And so it's kind of like the same idea there about the inverted U curve, and how I think this doesn't necessarily kind of like, you don't see a direct relationship with like advantageous, disadvantageous, kind of like that dichotomy, but Malcolm kind of popped that into this chapter 2 just like that.
Another thing to add to the classroom example for particularly less students is this is what he said in his book, but if you're a student, particularly a poor student, what you need is to have people around you asking the same questions, wrestling with the same issues, and worrying about the same things you are, so that you feel a little less isolated and a little more normal. This is the problem with a really small class. If there are too few students in the room, the chances that the children are surrounded by a critical mass of other people like them start to get really low. So it steals away, he says that it steals away the peers that struggle. It steals away the peers that struggling students learn from. So yeah.
本当. So that's a pretty cool observation, and makes me think, やっぱ何事も it's a spectrum. You not can't go, but either extreme is too much. I mean, these two it might
Mm.
be not the best. So think for yourself. Like our last week's influence notebook, no lesson is think for yourself. Look at your situation and analyze if what you're doing, the change you're incorporating, is helping or not.
Link to the podcast from last week in the description.
We will do that.
Yeah. So it's scary how people particularly in the authoritative positions, make decisions based on this intuition that smaller classroom sizes are better. And they even made schools based on this philosophy, even though it can be disadvantageous, like I just brought up in one of the quotes. So, yeah, like I said, we should take a step back and think for ourselves and see if it's actually beneficial. Although it might be difficult in the moment to see whether something is advantageous or not. And we'll talk about that later on, too, with the Impressionist movement. But, yeah. Scary. But
scary, but cool.
Eye-opening.
So that was chapter 2. And chapter 2, main thing was inverted U-curve. Chapter 1 is about Vivek and his full court press, advantageous, disadvantage, and stuff like that. So chapter 3, the title is Caroline Sachs. And I put in brackets and the Impressionists. And I think the main idea of chapter 3 is relative deprivation, which is, I think he coined it. I'm not sure, but he put it in quotation marks, so I'm guessing it is. That I think I want to start with the Caroline Sachs kana. Do you think it's a good idea, John? Or
yeah, I think we should start with Impressionists.
Okay.
It's more abstract in a way.
Do you want to take it away?
Sure. So in France, there were a group of artists that gathered at a cafe once every week or a couple times a week, and they talked about art, they talked about politics, they talked about history and whatnot, and they were motivating each other to just be alive, you know. And later on, they were called the Impressionists because of what they did. A major artist in that group was Monet and Pissarro. But these people became famous because of what they did in the context of competitions. So back then, they had this large competition, art gallery competition called the Salon, where artists can apply up to 3 paintings per year, I think. And if your artwork gets showcased, the entire city and pretty much the entire world gets to see it. So that was a pretty big deal. So to them, it was the most, quote unquote, most important exhibition or gallery in the world. So they worked really hard to try to make that competition. And in this competition, the Salon, even though you get selected, there's a subgroup called the Depotoir, which means the rubbish dump, where your paintings get showcased in a really small dark room where nobody can see it, or you can get your paintings can get showcased in the main hall, but really high up in the wall, so nobody's gonna see it either way. So the best place for your painting to be showcased is typically the eye level, where people can intuitively see without turning their heads much. So that's the Salon. And the majority of the group, the Impressionist groups, really didn't get attention from the Salon, but they really believed in their aesthetics towards the mundane daily perspective, while most of the themes or genres or the styles that the Salon picked up were mainly stories based on the war or stories based off of housemaids or something sexual, that kind of mainstream in that time um, genres were hot in the salon. So with this context, the Impressionists, they decided to make their own gallery and showcase their own work because they didn't really believe in that mainstream taste. So so they stopped applying to the salon and made their own gallery. But objectively, that's not a really good idea as an artist because without an audience, you won't get commissions, meaning you can't really survive. But to them, it was totally logical because that's what they truly believed in, and they didn't want to conform to the mainstream taste of the salon. So with that belief, they were actually able to amass a tremendous amount of audiences, even though it was such an independent and small exhibition. So, yeah. The main point of this story, of this chapter, is our cognitive bias towards elite institutions. And Malcolm Gladwell showcases this bias in a way that makes us a bit more critical towards the so-called Goliaths, or the elite institutions, in different circumstances. And the first one is, as I just explained, art exhibitions. And the second one we'll be talking about is by Caroline Sachs, who is a university applicant and is trying to decide what university to go to. But I guess I should pass this on to Lee Kai now.
Yeah, so she was a high school senior, and she got into both the University of Maryland and Brown University. And so if you were to look at it in terms of ranking, Brown University, I mean, it is an Ivy League too, so people would immediately think Brown University, wow, like reputation, come on, like it'll be better for your job application in the future. And then on top of that, there's more valedictorians and 4.0 GPA students that are attending Brown University. So, and Caroline was a brilliant person, and she studies, I think it was science. She's a generalist at science, and then but when she took organic chemistry, up to while she was also taking biochem, I mean the introductory bio and chemistry and all that stuff, she was struggling, but organic chemistry was the last straw, and she couldn't handle getting, I think it was just a lower grade, because all the other smart students were raising the standards, the grade, and so she basically lost confidence in herself, even though if you look at her like absolute like intelligence value, like IQ value, it would be much higher than the global population. だけど, but if we look at the relative, that's why the title is kind of like the relative deprivation. If you compare her intelligence amongst her peers, it's pretty, I guess it would be lower. And so she basically dropped out her intended major. I think she also, I forgot, John, correct me, I think she also dropped out of the school to go to Maryland. No, she didn't. She just changed into a different major. And so this also is related to this another thing that Malcolm was talking, not related, it's pretty much the same thing, but Malcolm had a talk, I think it was TED Talk, and John, we talked about this too, but he compared the students from Harvard, the SAT scores from students from Harvard, and SAT scores from another kind of generic university. And the lower third of the Harvard SAT scores were equivalent to the top third of the mediocre or the generic university. But when the researchers tracked these students later on in life, those students in the top third, regardless of the institution you attended, did well. And one example is kind of like this PhD at the economics PhD candidates. So same situation, economics PhD students from a top university, and then same PhD students from mediocre universities. They compare the number of published papers after they graduated, and I have it over here. Well, I think did I lose it? No, it's up here. So for the prestigious schools, the 95th percentile had very high publications, like 1 or 2 or 3, like 4, I think it was 3 plus publications per year. And then but then when you look at the 50th percentile of this prestigious schools candidates, they have little to no publication rates, so like 0 per year. But if you look at the mediocre schools, and the 95th percentile produce more, or almost, so they still produce more than the 50th percentiles in the prestigious schools. So does that make sense, John? Did I kind of explain that? Okay, so that is a powerful, I think, example to say that it's really important, or it could be really important, to put yourself into, or to be the big fish in a small pond, and to avoid being the small fish in a big pond, because through relative deprivation, it makes it difficult for you to gain or have confidence in yourself and be more successful in the generic, more plain term, or plain definition of it. So that's about this Caroline Sachs person, and 結構ね eye-opening だったかな.
It's scary. Like,
it is.
Even though Caroline Sachs was a really bright student compared, like I said, on a global scale, she felt worthless, and to the point where she had to drop out of her
major
STEM degree. Even though having a STEM degree back then was like one of the most important things a university student can do. It was like the golden ticket for a university student to have because of the high salary and prestige and whatnot. And I think this relative deprivation is really scary because it takes away your opportunity to to earn a STEM degree, even though you're capable of it. So your life can change greatly depending on how you place yourself. So what I think Malcolm Gladwell wanted to say was try to be the big fish in a little pond, like you said, while avoiding being the small fish in the big scary pond where it's hard for you to swim.
And he says we all love to think about the advantages of going to prestigious schools or any elite institutions, but you need to think about the risk of, I guess, being subject to this. He calls it the elite institution cognitive disorder, which I don't know if it's like he like officially coined it, but it's the mistaken belief that attending the most elite institution is always in your best interest っていうのは結構面白いと思いましたね。
So it's not really about how smart you are, but it's all up to like how you feel smart.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on that like it's not that Harvard makes you a smart person, but it's the type of people that are smart, or smart people that go to Harvard, and if you use that as the absolute truth, then it doesn't make sense to go to Harvard, because if you got accepted, that means you're already smart enough to be labeled as like Harvard student, right? But by actually going to Harvard, you're putting yourself at risk of the relative deprivation and losing confidence. And so like you won't be able to use that intelligence, even though you might actually be intelligent, is like really unfortunate. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though at the end of the road you can make the same amount of money even if you go to a mediocre school.
Yeah, 言ってたね。
So 本当に people should be careful of how they place themselves in different ponds.
And being too hung up on prestige and reputation, because not only in college but with anything in life, I think it's what you make out of it, what you do is important. It's not like the environment. You can do a lot even if you went to a generic school. And I would probably, if I had to do university again, I would probably do community in the States, community college for the first 2 years, just because the tuition is much cheaper, and transfer to another like a 4-year institution and then graduate with that school's name on it. But like, it's ちょっとこの relative debt rate 関係ないけど、if you get to save a lot of money by going to community school for the first 2 years, I'll definitely do that if I had to do it again. But yeah, anyways,
I think adding on to your retrospective decision on college, I think I would do something similar, but not only to save money, but like just try to make the time to figure out what you actually want to do before actually committing to somewhere just because it's prestigious or just because it's cool or whatever. Like, I feel like I would want to tailor my decision based on what I really associate to instead of the top-down image of that school.
Yeah.
Which means like you would have to do a lot of research. And I'm not sure. I guess the best way is to talk to the students who go to those schools and try to get yourself into the communities, into those communities where you can reach out to these people. But それもそれでちょっと難しそうだけど。
そうだね。But something to think about. So I think we're done with part 1, and we can move on to part 2, and this will be very short, but the title of part 2 is The Theory of Desirable Difficulty, and I think desirable difficulty is a keyword here, and this is my definition of it, but if I were to summarize it, it's how tragic events can often lead to renewal and better outlook because the victims learn to persevere even in the toughest times. And so chapter 4 in this part 2 is about 2 individuals, David Boyce and Gary Cohn, and they both have dyslexia, but nonetheless they still persevere and kind of reach or achieve many amazing things. So first person, David Boyce was like I said, dyslexic, but now he's a renowned lawyer, and he does but basically he's an amazing lawyer, and when he was young he couldn't read at all, right? So he had to rely on his mother to read and teach him stuff, and because of that he really relied heavily on auditory learning, and his memory became like really good and accurate, and so he was able to use that listening skills as a lawyer to excel in that field. That's I forgot the details, but that's the gist I got from that part. And then the second individual is Gary Cohn, and he is also dyslexic, and he had a hard time learning while he was young, and he was almost I think at the brink of like dropping out and all that stuff. But in order to get a job in the finance sector, he jumped in a cab with a stockbroker. And so he's actually at this office. I think it was some finance or bank office, and he was in the lobby, and he was kind of vigilantly watching around and looking for any executives or hiring managers. And he heard this person kind of going to like, oh, like yelling, not yelling, just saying, oh, I'm going to the airport right now, so I can't talk to you, blah, blah, blah. Like, this is just a random talk. And then, so Gary heard that, and he asked the executive, hey, I'm also going to this place. Oh, like, I think they were both going to the airport. Or the executive was going to the airport. So Gary was like, hey, I'm also going to the airport. Can I catch a cab with you? And so the stockbroker, or the executive was like, yeah, okay. They had a long drive or ride up to the airport. And in the meantime, Gary was convincing the executive how competent of a trader he is, option trader, that's what it is. And he lied about his, I guess, achievements and all that stuff, but in the end he got the job at that place. And so so now Gary, I searched up on Wikipedia. Gary is an American business leader who served as 11th director of the National Economic Council and chief economic advisor to President Donald Trump from 2017 to 2018. He managed the administration's economic policy agenda, and before serving in White House, Cohn was president and chief operating officer of Goldman Sachs, where he worked for more than 25 years. Cohn was appointed vice chairman of IBM on January 5th, 2021. So, both cases, dyslexia happened to push them harder to learn in different ways, and had to like so it's this desirable difficulty that forced them to be creative in how they had to succeed, but actually like putting them in a hard situation push them. I'm just repeating myself, actually pushing themselves harder than the usual individual って感じかな? Oh, I summarized it myself. I wrote, sometimes the things learned out of necessity are more powerful than the things that come easy. って感じ. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that was pretty much it. I think that story of Gary Cohn also came out in like another TED Talk about this person talking about faking it till you make it. Where you have to put an obligation in front of you, and then you have to run your way up there, kind of thing, instead of trying to build one step at a time. But to Gary, it was out of necessity, so more than discipline in a way.
Yeah.
So there are many ways, many interpretations, and many methods to find your own success, but this is one big example regarding desirable difficulties.
So, and then so chapter 5 is about this MLJ Freire.
Free reach.
Free reach. We will spell it FREIREICH, and if anyone knows how to pronounce that, please leave a message or comment down below. Oh, yeah. We would like to know that. And then so he was in his case, the desirable difficulty was this super duper disagreeableness, his tendency to disagree with many people, and he's stubborn about it, and he doesn't change his position a lot of times. And so Emil became a doctor, and again, put it simply, he went on to conduct bold experiments to find a 90% cure rate treatment for leukemia. and he had a lot of backlash and resistance with his experiments and his way of thinking, and he all the times had to get like approvals from the top management to in order to do his experiments. But this, I guess, Malcolm's point was that his disagreeableness might sound like a disadvantage because not many people liked him, but in the end it came out into something fruitful みたいな感じ。
Mm. Yeah.
So that's the gist.
Even though disagreeability in the social context can seem undesirable in many aspects, it can lead to such innovations だよね。っていうストーリーだったけど。Yeah. It's difficult because I feel like it really depends on what you apply your disagreeableness to. And yeah, even in his case, Free Reach's case, he was actually running through a lot of lives, like children. Like a lot of children were dying in his hands because of all the experimentations he was doing on them. One of the things that Free Reach was criticized for was his method of testing the children for leukemia, because he would have to extract bone marrow samples and blood samples to see if there are any cells left, cancer cells left in the blood. So he would stick huge, thick needles into the children's shins every single day to do that. And it was obviously painful. And a lot of children died in the process too, because he simply couldn't save them. So it cost a lot of lives without much assurance. Even though it did lead to a desirable outcome, it's really difficult to judge in that moment. So, yeah, it's a really tricky concept to swallow, but that's one of the retrospective examples of desirable difficulty, I guess.
So yeah, that was chapter 5, and we're going to skip chapter 6 because it wasn't too applicable for both of us and to kind of even talk about it. No disrespect to Wyatt Walker, who's a part of that chapter, but it was, yeah. So we'll move on to part 3, which is titled The Limits of Power. And the main thing I got from this chapter or part was this thing called principle of legitimacy, and it talks about it's in the context of authority and authoritative figure and someone subordinate, and so in order for the authoritative figure to have some weight in what they are telling or commanding the inferiors to do, are based on these three points. And so first of all, the people who are asked to obey authority have to feel like they have a voice, and that if they speak up, they will be heard. Second, the law has to be predictable. There has to be a reasonable expectation that the rules tomorrow are going to be roughly the same as rules today. And third, the authority has to be fair. It can't treat one group differently from another. And so I think the very easy, typical example would be parenting with multiple children. That first of all, if you follow the first principle, it'll be the parents would have to hear what the kids have to say and consider them genuinely and to incorporate them in their life or whatever. And the second point, it has to be predictable. So if on Monday my mom said no candy, no chocolate for the rest of her life, but then like on Thursday she says it's okay for my brother, then like it's like, whoa, why then? I guess that kind of incorporates the third part too, which is it has to be fair. It has to be predictable in a sense that my mom should be saying, hey, like, no, every week there's no chocolate, no chocolate, no chocolate. Not like every other week or like some random week it's like, oh yeah, you can do chocolate. And then the fairness part comes where she has to be strict to both me and my brother. And so I thought I want to put this into my reference file so that in the future when I have kids, I'll be aware of these principles and like be able to follow them. And I thought it was pretty. なんか考えても it makes sense, right? If you're the one obeying, you want to be respected in these terms too. And if you want, and then it'll make you more inclined to listen to the authority.
Yeah. An example that came out in the book was a teacher in a classroom full of kindergarten students or elementary students.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So these kids were really attentive and curious and were really studious. But as soon as the teacher started reading picture books to the students while sitting on the floor and having them gather around them, they started to get out of control and would run around and do cartwheels all over the room. And this was because she had one particular student stand next to her and read the picture book with her. So it was pretty much a one-on-one interaction between the student. So that treatment is not really considering the other students, which should be a classroom environment. And yeah, the way the authority treats the students gets reciprocated back to how they behave. So it's not really I don't know how I should say this, but yeah, so the reason why the kids were misbehaving was because they just couldn't stand not being involved in the interaction. So they started to lose control and whatnot. So from a third person's perspective, seeing the students do all of that in the classroom may seem like the kids are really misbehaving and it's an unruly classroom, but in essence, it's because the authority is not giving legitimate attention towards the students. So all that is to say that it's a reciprocatory relationship between the authority and the people who obeying the authority, rather than a one-way street. So it has to be legit from either party.
Yeah, and Malcolm added that when the law is applied in the absence of legitimacy, so this principle of legitimacy, it does not produce obedience, but it produces the opposite, and it leads to backlash. っていう感じで、なるんだね。So reciprocity が大事だね。本当。なんかit's weird. It's interesting because you would imagine reciprocating love or like respect to people that on your peers or like in like friendly environment relationships, but like even in hostile like these, there's opposition. It still holds true, and you still have to uphold that principle of respect or legitimacy for principle of reciprocity to each other.
Yeah. I just remembered another example where the authority tried to treat the people obeying well to prove their legitimacy. It's by a police officer in New York. So in the area, the Bronx area, because of the crime rates, some teenagers and young people were being monitored. And obviously the families of the parents of these children didn't like it. So they were really hostile towards the police. But one of the head officers, in order to alleviate the situation, the relationship between the police and the civilians, or the victims of victims, the two quote unquote to be juveniles, um, she decided to bring turkey to these families on Thanksgiving, and I think she like would use like $2,000 just for this, but the head also accepted this because they believed that it would establish a legitimate
Reciprocity.
reciprocal relationship between the police and the civilians. And yeah, the crime rates dropped significantly every year after this in that area. Well, a lot of other factors may have played in this happening, but yeah, this was definitely one of the significant factors that alleviated the crime rates in that area.
So to give a little bit more context, she searched for juveniles in Bronzeville who had been arrested at least once in the previous 12 months, and a search yielded 106 names and corresponding to 180 arrests. And so she would pretty much, like John said, she gave turkeys for Thanksgiving, and then they also told them, I know sometimes you can hate the police, I understand all that, but I just want you to know, as much as it seems like that we're harassing you by knocking on your door, we really do care and really want you to have a happy Thanksgiving. And this, Malcom says, was a plea for legitimacy. And so after that, the success with the turkeys, she also started Christmas toy giveaways. The task force, JRIP is the, what's it called? The Juvenile Robbery Intervention Program. So that's a program that Jeffy was responsible for, this whole like turkey thing. And so the task force started playing basketball with them, and they took them out for a sushi dinner to try to get summer jobs, help them get summer jobs and all that stuff. And so it reminds me of another book. I think it was I don't remember. But I think it was How to Win Friends and Influence Them. That one of the points, it reminds me of this story about this old man was at a park, and like there was this like group of teenager boys that were like being dangerous, or like some throwing like a baseball or whatever, but being like a 迷惑かけた to the surroundings. And instead of, it's a typical way of I don't know, like an agitated person would be like, yo, like stop, like threaten them, or like be like, yo, like in a hostile manner. But when this man approached them and be like, hey, like, no, I really understand that you want to have fun, and more like a civil way of like, I guess, following this principle legitimacy thing, he came up to them in a more civil manner, and that diffused, or like really, so like the book said, influenced the group of teenagers to not do the thing that the old man not do what the old man not want to do. But
so yeah, just the legitimacy legitimacy in action.
So
it's like a social phenomenon that we can't really, do anything with. It just exists.
Yeah. I think it's like another like cue that our previous book Influence was talking about. It's a natural cue to think of legit authorities with these principles, that they're fair, predictable, and listen to us. Yeah. So that, I guess that, if there's anything else from you, John, that concludes pretty much what we thought were important and learned the most from, and we added a little bit of our opinions and experiences too. Actually, This last bit, we wanted to talk about how, looking back on our life, we can relate to it, and then kind of close this podcast. I'll go first. So this reminds me of my so to give a little bit more context, I studied biochemistry in my undergrad, and then right now I'm in grad school studying computer science, and a lot of the common questions that are asked by the students to the academic advisor here is, hi, hey, I don't have an undergrad in computer science. Does that make me in a weaker position when I'm applying for job positions? And when I think of that question, it makes me think, it might, but also we end up graduating with a master's in computer science, so that should already prove that we are competent computer scientists. And it reminds me of the med school application system in the States, where they as in the med schools, don't necessarily require you to take biology, chemistry, or physics in your undergrad, and they only require you to do pre-med. This is as far as I know, and as long as you do pre-med on top of your major, which can be any major, you are good to go. And they enjoy that or they prefer you to do maybe liberal arts or non-STEM or non-medicine related, because that broadens your perspective. So there's an argument with that, and I think that applies to my situation too, where because I studied undergrad in biochem, my job prospective can also widen because of that. And I know other students that got job offers because the company liked that person's undergrad experience, if that makes sense. So, I don't really think my undergrad is a disadvantage anymore. It's more like I have 2 different degrees in 2 different fields, so that should put me in a better place, because I know 2 different areas みたいな感じのを思い出すかな、思い浮かぶ, because yeah, it's not really disadvantage anymore. It's an advantage. だんだん yeah 終了Oh, and then the Impressionists remind me of this phase that I had in undergrad, where I was applying to companies. I was applying to UC schools to transfer out of my undergrad from University of Washington, and almost every company or every university rejected me. So I'm like, I know I can do great, but I'm being pushed down by these institutions. Screw them. I want to do my own thing, and I want to do freelancing so that I can prove to everyone I'm competent, or I start my own company because I'm competent. So the Impressionists reminded me of that phase, and I still have that thought, but not as strong anymore. って感じかな?
Yeah. So yeah, speaking of the Impressionists, it's a significant thing they've done if we talk about it in retrospect. But if we put ourselves into their shoes in that moment, I bet they were filled with a lot of anxiety and doubt as well, because of the potential risks they're carrying, and everything can go wrong, and they could hardly survive without getting much attention in the art world. But carrying that, they were able to flourish. And I kind of relate with that myself in today, because I'm in a similar situation, trying to find my own way in a sense.
Mm.
I have a past of being rejected by photographers that I looked up to. Rejected as in I applied to become assistants for them. And it was funny because for one of them, in the applications, they said any experience is fine. If you can speak Japanese and English, just apply. So I applied, but I got rejected. And then in the next round, they needed studio experience. So that shows that you kind of, for him, he really values that somewhat, not corporate, but that official skill set or experience. But yeah, especially after meeting other photographers or other just creative people that didn't go through that path and found their own way, I was more convinced to stay on track with what I really believe in and try to establish my way like that instead of being really obsessive over just trying to assist for someone great. Or I do find them respectful. I do respect them a lot. I look up to them a lot, but I was reminded of how I should remind myself. I was reminded of how I should remind myself. I was reminded of how I should stay on track with what I believe in. Not to say I'm as talented or skillful as the Impressionists, but I do believe in what I believe in. So
I do believe in what you believe in, what you believe in too.
Thank you. And I believe in what you believe in, what I believe in, what I believe in.
Yeah, so それが一番だよ、ジョン。
Even though, yeah, like,
yeah.
Socially, it's a really risky and undefined, like uncertain. It's like Elon Musk says about starting a company. It's like staring into a void while eating glass. Although I'm not trying to compare myself with Elon Musk, that philosophy does, I feel, apply to a lot of the people trying to take the risks to for something that they really believe in, even though it might not look bright at the other end. But yeah, so this book, all in all, just encapsulates that perspective of trying to be critical about the pre-established so-called advantages and strengths, and trying to assess your say in the world, how you can play in the world. One example is the story of the turtle and the rabbit.
So the story, I think, is that the typical competition there, the race, is that like who can get to the not deadline, finish line, the quickest and fastest, and like the common notion is that like, well, like hair is faster. I mean, the lesson that you would learn from that would be that like persistence and effort is what matters, and like as long as you have that, which is the tortoise's case, you would win. So that's like the moral of the story, right? And that's a powerful lesson, but that's a powerful lesson only in a world where the tortoise and the hare are playing by the same rules and where everyone's effort is rewarded. But in a world that isn't fair, like you have to change things up. And so the twist in what Malcolm's story of this tortoise and hare the story that he says had a twist, where I'm gonna read it out. Says, and this is actually tortoise and the deer, kana. So
yeah,
the tortoise's name is Terrapin, The story of Terrapin, a lowly turtle who finds himself in a race with deer. He hides just by the finish line and places his relatives up and down the course at strategic intervals to make it seem like he is running the whole race. Then at the finish line, he emerges just ahead of Deer to claim victory. Deer is completely fooled since, as Terrapin knows, to Deer, all turtles, quotation marks, says, am so much like a near you can't tell one from I'm not sure, but I'm pretty much saying like they just look the same. So they can't, the deer doesn't see any difference. And so like we all think it's fair to like the story, traditional story of like being persistent sounds like a reasonable lesson. だけど we forget the fact that like, hey, the world is unfair, and in this case, like the hare is like we're competing on a metric, on speed, which obviously the turtle is already weak on, and the hare is like at this strong point. And then so like if you want to survive in this unfair world, you really have to be a trickster. So Malcolm says the trickster is not a trickster by nature, but he is a trickster by necessity. And so なんていうかな cheating, I think, yeah, my take on this is like cheating is looked badly, but we can't forget that the system or the game that we're playing might already be rigged, and that cheating is the only way to win the game. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit more extreme take and look of the lesson that we learned in this book, which is like every situation there's advantage and disadvantage, and the tortoise story is taking a step back and be like, yeah, like there are other people that are advantageous and they're unfairly advantageous, and so you might have to do something that might look like it's cheating, but it's you're actually just like being a trickster by necessity to win in this world. So I think that's a really cool and powerful message. So like, not to be like you can't go. I don't think you can. It means to be unethical. Go around and start cheating, but like, I think there's some justifiable cheating or exploitations in life too.
Yeah.
Does that? Did I was able to speak on your behalf about the story?
Yes. Yeah, so that story really encapsulates the essence of this book, I think, where we should be really critical of the pre-established norms and instead try to mesh our own advantages and take advantage of your own advantages, not based on the world's advantages.
Because the turtle was smart and he deserved to win.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah.
So yeah, play by your own rules, I think, is a key message. だね。
そうだね。It was a pretty good book, and 違うか。It's Outliers, by the book by Malcom. That's apparently a classic, read in high school. But I think David and Goliath is also a really good book by Malcom. It's 本当ね、いいね。I really like these, like taking a step back and looking, yo, whoa, like hold up, is this actually legit to begin with? So because no, not because, but I like to ask why in a lot of stuff. So this is like related to that. It's like, because we're doubting, or like we're thinking twice about the, like you said, predetermined notions in the world, that we're kind of like forced to believe in or like naturally believe in, but we don't have to. You can always think for yourself.
Yeah.
Which is a plug for Influence, our previous podcast.
Or it might be a foreshadowing that every book will be concluded with this message.
That's so true. There's a pattern so far.
Think for yourself. Don't jump to conclusions.
Yeah.
だね。
Okay, so we will conclude David and Goliath with that. And next week, we will read Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. And I already read the book, so I know I can talk about it a little bit, but yeah, there's a section where you have to think about yourself. Flex janai. But there's a part you do have to think for yourself, and I think we will have to conform or like go on with our think for yourself train.
Well, see you guys on that Think for Yourself train next week as well. Hopefully, you'll catch the train.
I'll see you at the next station.
What's the next station?
Digital minimalism.
Ah, そっかそっか。ごめん。
Yeah. Just disconnected there. That was bad Wi-Fi, like earlier.
いや、ちょっとラグあったね、今の。
Well, I got that.
Okay.
But thank you for listening, everyone.
See you guys at
And
the
like I
next
said-
station.
Yo. You can't take my joke, man. I'll see you guys at the next station.
どうぞどうぞ。
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.